Hey guys, tonight we're starting with a topic that's a little less heavy and a whole lot more greasy. Medieval junk food. Because even in a world without drive-thrus, corner stores, or hot dog carts, people still managed to snack. Some of it was tasty, some of it was questionable, and all of it was unmistakably medieval. So before you get too cozy, if you'd be so kind, gently give the new hype feature a test and hype this video. It might seem small, but it truly helps us little guys keep trudging forward through the YouTube algorithm. Think of it as tossing a coin in the hat of a tired medieval bard. It makes a difference. And as always, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to see who else is drifting off with us from all around the world. Now get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. Picture yourself trudging through a muddy street in 14th century London. It's mid-afternoon. You've already been awake since dawn, and the single hunk of bread you gnawed at breakfast has long since abandoned you. Your belly complains, but dinner isn't for hours, and supper, if it happens at all, depends on whether the Lord's steward feels generous or whether your wages will stretch to buy more grain. You don't need a full feast. You need something quick, greasy, and comforting. In other words, you need medieval junk food. To us, junk food means neon bags of crisps, drive-through windows, and energy drinks that taste like liquefied glow sticks. For a medieval peasant or even a bustling merchant, junk food meant anything portable, cheap, and high in calories. It wasn't a planned meal. It was what you grabbed on the go, what you bought at a stall outside the church fair, or what you scraped together in desperation when the stew pot ran dry. Snacks were not frivolous. They were survival disguised as indulgence. At its heart, the existence of medieval junk food was an act of defiance against hunger. The Middle Ages were plagued by shortages, famines, and unpredictable harvests. One bad year of weather, and suddenly bread prices shot up, leaving whole towns chewing bark or boiling weeds for dinner. Yet humans, being stubborn creatures, insisted on finding ways to slip in small pleasures between the relentless grind of survival. That meant frying a little dough in reused pig fat, soaking stale bread in ale until it became something vaguely edible, or buying a hunk of candied fruit from a traveling peddler, even if it cost you a week's patience with toothaches. The common denominator was grease. Fat was precious, hoarded, and repurposed to the point where it developed a life story. A ladle of congealed lard might have fried eels yesterday, onions this morning, and by evening it was bubbling with yet another round of batter. The smell clung to market squares, saturating cloaks and hair. That haze of cooking fat drifting over town was medieval advertising, luring hungry passers-by to part with a coin for something hot and comforting. The snack wasn't necessarily good, but it was warm, filling, and cheaper than sitting down for a proper meal. Ale was the other essential ingredient in the medieval snacking world. It wasn't just a drink, it was liquid bread, liquid medicine, and liquid excuse. Water sources were often unsafe, and ale, weak or strong, was safer. That meant most people consumed it daily, and sometimes it doubled as food itself. Stale bread soaked in ale became a mushy dish called sops, both snack and solution to the eternal problem of hard loaves. A mug of ale with a bit of fried cake was the medieval equivalent of coffee with a donut. Quick energy, cheap buzz, and enough comfort to keep you going through another stretch of labor. Desperation shaped every aspect of this snacking culture. Junk food existed because meals were not guaranteed. Work in the fields or the workshops was punishing, hours long, and rarely paused for a proper banquet. Portable snacks let people keep moving while their hands stayed busy. Peddlers capitalized on this, setting up stalls at churchyards, markets, and city gates, selling fried fish, small pies, honey cakes, and candied seeds. Buying one meant trading hard-earned pennies for the luxury of not fainting on the way home. There was also the thrill of indulgence. If survival demanded monotony, endless bread, endless pottage, then junk food was the crack in the wall, a momentary rebellion against bland necessity. Imagine the shock of biting into something spiced with cinnamon, sweetened with imported sugar, or fried to a crisp golden edge. Even if it wasn't much, even if it was fleeting, it carried the promise of pleasure. And people always crave pleasure, even when life is hard, maybe especially when life is hard. Of course, medieval authorities didn't always look kindly on this snacking culture. Guilds tried to regulate what could be sold, how much it cost, and whether it was pure enough to qualify as food. Bakers might be fined for making loaves too small, tavern keepers punished for watering down ale. But the people buying eel pies on a street corner weren't looking for official approval. They wanted calories, salt, fat, and sugar in whatever form they could afford. And so junk food thrived in the shadows of the church, in the smoke of fairs, in the alleys outside castles, feeding both the poor and the rich, who slipped out of feasts to nibble something forbiddenly cheap. There was also the undeniable link between junk food and class. Nobles could gorge on lavish banquets, yet even they indulged in small bites between meals. Candied nuts, exotic fruit pastes, spiced wine sops. For the lower classes, junk food was less indulgence than necessity, the thing that filled the gap when a single loaf of bread couldn't stretch. But across the spectrum, everyone shared the same instinct, the need for something immediate, greasy, sweet, or fried. That desire blurred lines of wealth, if only for a bite. The result is that medieval junk food wasn't just about hunger. It was about comfort, community, and tiny rebellions against the constant uncertainty of life. The man buying blood pudding balls wasn't just feeding his stomach, he was asserting a little control, choosing pleasure in a world that offered few guarantees. The child chewing on candied fennel seeds was tasting luxury at a fraction of the cost, a sugared whisper of far-off lands. The woman warming her hands over a pie seller's brazier might have been buying heat as much as food, trading coins for the comfort of grease-soaked pastry. In other words, medieval junk food was a survival strategy dressed up as indulgence. It was born out of desperation, but flavored with imagination, making the best of what was available. Grease, ale, scraps, and a stubborn human refusal to settle for blandness. That's why it existed, and that's why, when you squint hard enough at your own late-night fast food run, you might just see the echo of a medieval cook stirring a pot of reused lard, ready to fry you a taste of survival. Imagine the clang of church bells rolling over a medieval town square, the kind of sound that shook dust from rafters and reminded everyone both of salvation and of the fact that their stomachs were growling. By midday, the streets around the churchyard or the market hall would fill with a chaos of noise and smells that would make a modern food festival seem tame. This was the beating heart of medieval junk food culture. Fairs, taverns, and market stalls, each one a theater of hunger and quick satisfaction. Street fairs were the great equalizer, those brief explosions of color and sound that brought together peasants, merchants, pilgrims, and even the occasional noble in disguise. The fairground was as much about eating as it was about buying cloth or watching jugglers. Sellers set up makeshift stands of wood and cloth, braziers glowing beneath pots of oil or embers hot enough to blister your face if you leaned too close. Here you could grab a meat pasty, a hot pie, or a slab of fried fish skin while weaving between crowds of performers and preachers. Imagine the smell: smoke, animal sweat, damp wool, and suddenly a waft of honey cake sizzling in fat. That was the scent of temptation, as irresistible then as popcorn at a cinema now. The sellers themselves were not always the most respectable folk. Many were women, widows or single mothers, who carved out a living one pie at a time. Others were opportunists, ready to vanish when guild inspectors came sniffing for unlicensed trades. And then there were the professional hawkers, the ones who knew how to bark loudly enough to cut through the din of fiddles and shouting. They promised the crispiest eel, the sweetest fritter, the flakiest pastry. Whether or not the reality matched the boast was another matter. Yet people paid because the need to eat, and to eat fast, outweighed suspicion. Taverns provided another layer of this snacking economy, more stable and slightly more respectable, though never without their share of grime. A medieval tavern was dim and smoky, packed with bodies, where the floors grew slick from spilled ale and worse. Here, junk food wasn't just an option, it was essential, because no one could drink for hours without soaking it up with bread or hot pies. Ale flowed constantly, and alongside it came trenchers of cheese curds, bowls of stewed beans, and slabs of fried dough. For travelers, the tavern was both bed and kitchen, a place where you could find a greasy plate of something hot long after market stalls had shuttered. It was the medieval fast food drive-through, except you stayed to argue with strangers about taxes and saints. What made taverns so crucial was the sense of community they fostered. Eating in the street was practical, but eating in a tavern meant being part of a roaring crowd. News spread there as quickly as ale spilled. Deals were struck, marriages arranged, fights started. And always, snacks were the currency that kept it going, little dishes and bites that filled the gaps between tankards. Bread soaked in broth, eel pies wrapped in greasy crust, chunks of sausage fried until charred. These were not delicacies, but they carried the weight of belonging. To snack in a tavern was to join the noise of the world. Market stalls lived somewhere between the chaos of fairs and the permanence of taverns. These were daily fixtures in towns and cities, wooden counters covered with cloth to protect against rain, baskets filled with whatever the seller had managed to acquire. Housewives bought onions, merchants haggled for spices, and workers stopped for something they could eat with one hand. That was the defining feature of medieval market snacks: portability. A pie wrapped in pastry, a fritter wrapped in linen, a small cake hardened enough to survive the journey home. Stalls thrived on speed, offering quick bites that kept customers on their feet and heading to the next booth. The life of a stallholder was precarious. They worked at the mercy of weather, guild rules, and hungry crowds that could turn hostile if the food ran out. Yet they were essential to the rhythm of the town. Without market stalls, there was no daily fix of fried onions, no roasted chestnuts in winter, no quick mugs of spiced ale to take the chill off. They fueled the workers who built cathedrals, the apprentices who carried goods, the pilgrims passing through. Their food was not memorable in taste, but unforgettable in function. It kept you alive until the next meal, and sometimes that was enough. If fairs were celebrations and taverns were gatherings, market stalls were survival. Together, these three pillars created the infrastructure of medieval junk food. They turned the act of eating into something communal, visible, and woven into the very fabric of daily life. People could not always afford feasts, but they could afford a pie at the market. They might never sit at a noble's table, but they could stand shoulder to shoulder in a tavern with a hot plate in hand, and they could, at least during the brief span of a street fair, taste something sweet or fried that made the grind of existence fade for a moment. It is easy to think of medieval life as endless hunger punctuated by rare banquets, but the truth is more complicated. People snacked, constantly and creatively, because they had to. Fairs, taverns, and stalls were more than points of commerce. They were the arteries that kept towns and villages alive, pumping grease, ale, and smoke through their veins. Every bite sold in these places was more than food. It was fuel for work, a taste of pleasure, and a reminder that even in a world of mud, toil, and prayer, humans have always found ways to eat on the go. Close your eyes and picture a medieval town. The air smells of smoke and damp wool. Horses clatter down cobbled streets, and the river beside the walls runs brown with waste. You could dip your cup into that water if you wanted, but you'd be gambling with your bowels. In a world without chlorine or pipes, water was less a thirst quencher and more a slow-acting weapon. And so, across Europe, people turned instead to a different liquid foundation of daily life: ale. Not just for festivals, not just for drunks, but for everyone: children, laborers, monks, and nobles alike. It was safer than water, and it was food as much as drink. Ale wasn't just an option, it was a necessity, brewed from grain, water, and yeast, then boiled until it shed its lethal bacteria. It came out weak in alcohol compared to modern beer, but strong enough to keep things alive. What it lacked in sparkle, it made up for in reliability. You knew you could drink ale and not end up doubled over in a ditch 2 hours later. That made it the backbone of medieval hydration, consumed from dawn until dusk. Imagine starting your morning not with coffee but with a mug of warm, frothy ale sliding down your throat before you trudged off to the fields. That was normal. Children sipped it too, their versions watered down to small ale, a kind of kindergarten brew that kept them alive long enough to complain about chores. Calories were the secret gift hidden in every mug. Grain turned into liquid meant energy without chewing, a kind of medieval protein shake with a frothy head. For a laborer swinging a scythe in summer or a mason hauling stones for a cathedral, ale delivered both hydration and sustenance. To call it drink understates its role. It was liquid bread, pouring fuel straight into the bloodstream. That is why medieval records don't always separate food from drink in accounting rolls. Ale counted as rations, as wages, as part of the basic calorie budget of existence. And because it was everywhere, it seeped into the snack culture as naturally as grease. Stale bread dipped in ale softened into sops, a quick meal disguised as an accident. Frying batters sometimes used ale as the liquid base, adding flavor and a little puff. Pies might be served with ale sauces, onions stewed in ale, sausages simmered in it. At taverns, nothing arrived without a tankard beside it, because the liquid seasoned every bite, washed down every scrap, and stretched every meal. If medieval junk food was the flesh, ale was the blood pulsing through it. It wasn't all romance, of course. Brewing was fickle, tied to the rhythms of harvest and weather. Barley shortages could turn ale thin, sour, or scarce, and when it soured too far, it tasted like chewing wet straw left out in the rain. But the demand never wavered. Alewives, women who brewed in their homes, kept the system afloat, selling by the jug to neighbors, travelers, or street hawkers. Their signs were simple: a pole with a bush of greenery hanging above the door. Step inside, hand over a coin, and you'd have a pint of survival. Yet they lived under constant suspicion, accused of watering down their brew or overcharging. Officials inspected ale with iron rods dipped into vats, measuring its density and scolding or fining when it fell short. Even junk food had bureaucracy hanging over it. Still, despite the watchful eyes of guilds and bailiffs, ale was democratic in a way few things were. Everyone drank it, from peasants in smoky huts to kings in stone halls. Nobles had stronger brews, monks perfected recipes in monasteries, and peasants settled for whatever was foaming in the pot. But the act of drinking ale linked them. You could be kneeling on rush-covered tavern floors or sitting beneath a chandelier, and still, the taste of malted grain tied your lips to the same tradition. It was one of the rare cultural equalizers in a world obsessed with hierarchy. And then, of course, there was the drunkenness. Medieval ale was weaker than modern beer, but not so weak that 4 pints at noon left you whistling hymns in tune. Drunken calories counted as food, yes, but drunken stumbling counted as a civic nuisance. Sermons raged against it, tavern fights erupted over it, and towns passed ordinances trying to limit excessive drinking, all while knowing full well that nobody was about to stop. Ale made people rowdy, but it also made them forget hunger and fear, and sometimes forgetting was worth the bruises. Picture a medieval fair again, the noise of traders barking, the stench of animals, the cries of children tugging at sleeves. In your hand is not a bottle of water. It is a wooden cup sloshing with ale. You take a gulp, bite into a hot pie fried in fat, and feel, just for a moment, like the world is tolerable. That was the role of ale. It kept you alive, kept you working, kept you eating, and dulled the sharp edges of a hard life. Without ale, medieval junk food would not have existed as it did. It flavored the doughs, soaked the bread, filled the bellies, and blurred the nights. It was the liquid foundation, a drink masquerading as food, or perhaps food masquerading as drink. Either way, it was safer than the water, more filling than broth, and more comforting than the silence of an empty stomach. It wasn't just a beverage. It was survival poured into a mug, clinking on every table from the poorest shack to the grandest hall. Imagine the orchard first, heavy with apples that weren't bred to be pretty or glossy, but simply to survive the climate. They were smaller, tartar, sometimes mottled, and often worm-kissed before they even hit the ground. In autumn, children climbed trees, sleeves stuffed with stolen fruit, while adults pretended not to notice so long as a few baskets still made it to market. Apples were cheap, common, and everywhere, but that didn't mean they were boring. In the hands of a medieval cook with a pot of hot pig fat and a little flour, they became something unexpected, the ancestor of the donut. The basic trick was simple. Slice an apple, dip it in batter, and drop it into boiling lard. The fruit softened into sweetness, the batter puffed and crisped, and the kitchen filled with a smell that could make even the damp rushes on the floor seem less miserable. These fritters were not dainty desserts for noble banquets alone. They were the kind of treat you could find sizzling on a market stall, or offered at a fair where every passerby had a coin to spare and a craving for something indulgent. The process was both ingenious and reckless, because lard at full heat is as dangerous as it is delicious. But medieval cooks lived in a world where risk and reward often tasted the same. The fat used was rarely fresh. Every kitchen kept a jar or pot of reused grease, a murky archive of previous meals, in which yesterday's fish might linger alongside last week's onions. Into that history went the battered apple slices, crackling as they sank, the scent of fruit fighting with the ghosts of meat and smoke. What came out was golden and sticky, the apple inside tender, the outside crisp, and the entire thing hot enough to scorch your tongue if impatience got the better of you. And impatience almost always won, because no one waited politely when food this good was finally ready. Fritters thrived because they were versatile. Apples were the star, but pears or other fruits could be swapped in when the season allowed, and spices like cinnamon or nutmeg, expensive contraband, trickling in from the east, turned the humble snack into a luxury. Sugar, when available, could be dusted on top, though honey was more common, dripping down fingers and leaving sticky trails for flies. In taverns, fritters appeared beside mugs of ale, softening the bitterness of drink and filling stomachs that couldn't afford more. At fairs, they were sold from smoky stalls where the frying never stopped, a medieval version of carnival food that lured customers from across the square. They weren't just food, though. They were spectacle. Imagine the hiss as battered fruit hit hot fat, the sizzle louder than a gossiping crowd. People gathered, drawn by the noise and the aroma, watching as the cook flipped golden rounds with a wooden paddle. Children begged, adults bargained, coins clinked into greasy hands, and the cook kept frying, sweat and smoke mingling in the air. The fritter was more than sustenance. It was an event, a sensory promise of pleasure in a life otherwise dominated by routine and labor. But pleasure came with a price. Apples might be common, yet flour and oil were not endless, and fritters were a small luxury for many. They were also a health gamble. Reused lard could carry the tang of rancid fat, and the batter itself might be stretched thin with whatever filler was on hand. Bite into the wrong fritter, and you risked a crunch of grit or the sourness of spoiled fruit hidden beneath batter. Still, people took the risk. because indulgence mattered more than perfection. In a world where famine was a memory always lurking around the corner, the chance to eat something unnecessary and joyful was reason enough. Fritters also slipped into religious life. On feast days, when fasting rules lifted, they were cooked in abundance, fried by the dozen, and served at celebrations. Monasteries recorded recipes for them, the batter sometimes laced with ale, making them both pious offering and guilty pleasure. They bridged sacred and profane, eaten by monks in cloisters and by peasants leaning against tavern walls. Sweet, greasy, hot, and fleeting, they transcended class, even as the quality of ingredients reminded everyone who had money and who did not. What makes the apple fritter feel like the medieval donut is not just the frying or the sweetness, but its role as a cultural release valve. Just as modern donuts live in office break rooms, on police station counters, and in boxes shared at late-night gatherings, medieval fritters carried the same spirit of communal indulgence. They were not a meal you ate alone in silence. They were shared, stolen, fought over, devoured in company, dripping grease onto sleeves and staining fingers. They reminded everyone that life, however harsh, could still be sweet, even if only for the few minutes it took to eat one. Think of the contrast. Daily meals meant coarse bread, pottage of beans or peas, endless repetition of the same brown gruel. Then, suddenly, a fritter, crisp, golden, perfumed with spice or honey, an explosion of flavor against the dullness of routine. That was the magic. It wasn't about nutrition or fullness. It was about pleasure and about choosing joy, even in a time when joy was scarce. So, when you imagine a medieval apple fritter, don't think of neat rings with powdered sugar sitting in a bakery window. Think of a smoky market stall, a sweating cook, and a bubbling pot of reused lard. Think of stolen apples turned into something miraculous. Think of peasants licking honey from their fingers and nobles sneaking second helpings at feasts. It was the donut before donuts, the first fried indulgence, proof that even in an age of scarcity, humans have always known how to transform hunger into celebration. Picture a kitchen in the dim light of a medieval evening, rushes on the floor turning sour underfoot, and a pot of honey simmering thick on the fire. The air is heavy, sweet to the point of cloying, and every surface is sticky enough to trap a fly for eternity. This was the world of the honey cake, a snack that straddled the line between comfort and punishment. Depending on the recipe, you either bit into bliss or you risked cracking a tooth. Either way, honey cakes were everywhere, clutched in the hands of peasants and nobles alike, their golden sheen promising pleasure even when reality delivered something more like a chewable brick. Honey was the medieval sweetener, the one luxury that filtered down through all levels of society, though not equally. Sugar was rare and costly, trickling in from far-off plantations and guarded like treasure, but honey was closer at hand, produced in skeps and hives that dotted fields and cloisters. That meant, if you wanted sweetness in your life, honey was your only option, and honey cakes became the natural vessel for that craving. Flour, sometimes rye or barley, was mixed with eggs if you had them, nuts if you were lucky, spices if you were truly blessed, and always a lavish hand of honey. The batter could be baked or fried, sometimes steamed, sometimes hardened into a lump designed to last for months. You didn't need to eat much. One bite stuck to your ribs and your teeth. The texture was the great gamble. Fresh from the pan or oven, a honey cake could be chewy, fragrant, and addictive, the kind of thing that made you forget the taste of bland porridge for at least a moment. But left too long on a shelf, the honey crystallized and the cake stiffened, turning it into a dense, jaw-breaking mass. Soldiers carried them on campaign because they lasted forever, but biting into one after weeks of marching might mean pain rather than pleasure. Children gnawed them like candy. Monks nibbled them in cloisters, and merchants tucked them into packs for long journeys. They were food, and they were ballast, dessert, and weapon, sustenance and test of endurance all at once. At fairs, Honey cakes were part of the spectacle. Sellers hawked them in baskets lined with cloth, their surfaces gleaming in the sun, glistening like golden bricks. Buyers knew they weren't just purchasing food. They were purchasing a portable luxury, something sweet enough to cut through the monotony of their diet. A peasant might share one cake among several children, each sticky bite treasured, while a noble might gorge on them at feasts, the honey dripping down gilded platters. The paradox was that the same snack could appear both on a straw mat in a smoky hut and on a polished table beneath candlelight, proof that sweetness transcended social boundaries, even if the quality of ingredients did not. And then there was the mess. Honey cakes clung to fingers, glued themselves to clothing, and stuck in hair. Eating one without becoming a sticky disaster was impossible, but maybe that was part of the charm. In a world where washing was a chore and soap a rarity, stickiness was just another hazard of living. Children laughed with honey smeared across their faces, and adults licked their fingers clean without shame. To eat a honey cake was to embrace chaos, to let sweetness trump neatness, to accept that joy sometimes leaves stains. Monasteries gave the honey cake a sacred edge. Recipes were preserved in their kitchens, often enriched with nuts or dried fruits, and served on feast days as treats that marked holy occasions. In this setting, the honey cake wasn't just indulgence, it was symbolism. Honey was purity, sweetness from God's own creation, and baking it into cakes became a way to fold spirituality into daily life. But once those same cakes found their way into the hands of travelers and traders, they lost their halo and became practical, dense food that could endure journeys, feed hungry mouths, and, if necessary, double as a bludgeon when the road grew unsafe. What makes honey cakes fascinating is how they highlight medieval resilience. With limited ingredients, people created something that could be both delicious and durable, something that might comfort a child or sustain a soldier. The line between dessert and ration blurred, and in that blur lay the truth of medieval junk food. Pleasure was never pure. It was always tempered by necessity. A honey cake might be the highlight of a feast, or it might be the hard lump gnawed on during famine, but either way, it stood as proof of how desperately people wanted sweetness in their lives. Think of the duality. One day the honey cake is soft, warm, aromatic, spiced with cloves and cinnamon if fortune smiles. Another day, the same cake is a fossil, scraped with a knife to yield crumbs that taste of sugar and dust. Brick or bliss, it was still eaten, still cherished, still fought over, because in a world where hunger was constant and sugar was rare, the promise of sweetness carried weight. To bite into a honey cake was to gamble, but it was a gamble people took again and again, because sometimes the reward was joy, and joy was priceless. So when you imagine the medieval honey cake, picture both extremes. See the smiling child with sticky hands, the monk savoring a soft slice at a feast, the soldier biting down hard enough to wince but chewing anyway because it's all he has left in his pouch. It was indulgence and endurance, fleeting pleasure and lasting hardship. A dessert that could double as a weapon, a reminder that even in a world of scarcity, humans clung to sweetness, no matter how solidly it fought back. Imagine finishing a meal of salted fish and onions in a smoky tavern, the kind of dinner that lingered on your breath long after the plates were cleared. You wipe your hands on your tunic, reach into a small pouch, and pop a few shiny seeds into your mouth. They crunch between your teeth, sharp with sweetness and trailing a ghost of licorice. The taste cuts through the grease and garlic, leaving you faintly perfumed, as if you had just kissed a spice merchant instead of a herring. These were candied fennel seeds, the medieval answer to breath mints, half luxury and half necessity, consumed with equal parts pleasure and fear. The process to make them was deceptively simple. Fennel seeds, already pungent with an anise kick, were rolled again and again in hot sugar syrup until they built up a glossy shell. Each layer hardened into crunch, turning something tiny and medicinal into something shiny and enticing. The method demanded patience and a steady hand. Too much heat, and the sugar burned. Too little, and it slid off without sticking. The result, when done well, was a sweet little pebble that sparkled like jewelry, perfect for slipping into a pocket or pressing into a guest's palm at the end of a meal. For a culture obsessed with symbolism, it mattered that fennel was linked to health, digestion, and even warding off evil spirits. Eating these seeds wasn't just vanity. It was, at least in theory, good for you. In practice, they were also a gamble. Medieval dentistry was an exercise in pain management more than prevention, and biting into hard sugar shells was not without risk. A careless crunch could chip enamel already weakened by stone-ground flour, and suddenly your treat doubled as a torture device. Still, people kept chewing because the benefits outweighed the dangers. Sweetness was rare, and freshness even rarer. In a world where rotting teeth were as common as fleas, the promise of smelling even slightly more appealing was worth the risk of another cracked molar. Candied fennel seeds appeared most often in wealthy households, their very existence tied to the expense of sugar. To coat such tiny things in such costly sweetness was extravagant, a way to flaunt resources by turning the mundane into a luxury. At feasts, they were handed around after the courses, part entertainment, part palate cleanser, part flex. Picture a candlelit hall where guests gnawed through venison, rabbit, pies, and puddings, only to end with a delicate handful of sugar-glazed seeds. It wasn't enough to fill a stomach, but it was enough to make mouths feel less like butcher's stalls. For the nobility, candied fennel seeds were the edible equivalent of perfume. But they weren't confined to castles. Apothecaries sold them as digestive aids, bundling them into little packets for anyone with a few coins. Pilgrims chewed them on the road. Merchants nibbled them between deals, and even tavern-goers could sometimes afford a sprinkle to chase down ale. Their portability made them perfect for travelers, a comfort against the stench of inns and the nausea of bad food. They blurred the line between medicine and junk food, functioning as both sweet indulgence and cure. That liminal role was exactly what made them thrive, because people love believing that pleasure can also be healthy. The sensory experience mattered. You started with the crunch, a satisfying crack of sugar breaking between your teeth. Then the sweetness surged, brief but intense, dissolving into a lingering licorice note that coated the tongue. The aftertaste was sharp enough to mask ale breath, onion breath, even the sour tang of blood pudding. For a few minutes you carried an aura of refinement, a trick of chemistry masquerading as class. Of course, once the effect faded, you were back to reality, but for those moments, you were elevated. Candied fennel seeds also carried a social dimension. To offer them was to signal generosity, refinement, and access to costly sugar. Lovers might share them in secret, merchants might use them to sweeten deals, and households might pass them out on feast days to impress guests. Even a small handful glittered with significance. They were tokens of wealth compressed into candy form, luxury disguised as hygiene, and yet, despite their lofty associations, they still belonged to the realm of junk food. They weren't necessary, they weren't filling, and they weren't cheap. They were little indulgences, addictive precisely because they were fleeting. One seed led to another, until the pouch was empty and the teeth ached from sugar. Medieval people knew this pattern well. Pleasure was always balanced by pain, indulgence by consequence. Every candied fennel seed was a reminder of that truth, just as much as it was a reminder that garlic breath could ruin your evening. Imagine a medieval street fair, smoke and shouting thick in the air, and a vendor selling not just pies and fish but small paper twists of candied seeds. Children clamored for them like modern kids beg for lollipops, while adults weighed the price against the fleeting joy. Some bought, some passed by, but everyone understood their power. In that pouch was more than candy. There was status, health, pleasure, and risk, all wrapped in sugar. So when you picture candied fennel seeds, don't think of them as quaint little curiosities. Think of them as medieval breath mints with teeth, both literally and figuratively. Sweet, sharp, dangerous, and irresistible. A snack that masked the smells of a world without toothpaste, that teased with promises of health while threatening dental disaster, and that, in its glittering sugar shell, contained the eternal human desire to eat something unnecessary just because it feels good. Picture the medieval table stripped down to its bare essentials: bread, pottage, and maybe, if you were lucky, a hunk of cheese. Against this backdrop of heaviness and sameness, dried fruit glittered like tiny jewels. They weren't just food, they were bursts of sweetness in a world that had precious little sugar. Figs from the south, raisins plucked from sun-wrinkled grapes, dates dragged across continents by caravan, prunes cured into chewy darkness. Each piece was both candy and cargo, a luxury that traveled farther than most people ever would. The act of biting into one was like tasting a distant landscape, even if all you tasted afterward was the sharp complaint of a molar threatening mutiny. Raisins were the everyman's dried fruit, showing up in markets, in bread, and in the occasional hand-to-mouth snack. They were easier to transport and lasted longer than fresh grapes, making them a staple not just for peasants with a coin to spare, but also for merchants, stocking ships, and soldiers carrying provisions. Figs, plumper and sweeter, arrived as exotic imports, their sticky interiors clinging to your teeth with both charm and menace. Dates were rarer still, treasured gifts from warmer climates, eaten slowly as if savoring their rarity could stretch their sweetness into eternity. And then there were prunes, humble, wrinkled, and suspiciously medicinal, consumed with the knowledge that too many could turn an indulgence into an urgent problem. They were the candy that doubled as a laxative, which made them both popular and feared. What made dried fruit irresistible was the way it condensed flavor. Water gone, what remained was pure sweetness, concentrated and chewy, clinging stubbornly to teeth and fingers alike. In an age where honey was precious and sugar a luxury beyond most purses, dried fruit was a miracle of preservation and indulgence combined. It filled pastries, sweetened breads, and appeared at feasts in bowls that nobles picked at between courses of roasted meats and fish. To nibble a fig beside your trencher of venison was to declare that you not only had wealth but also taste that reached beyond the local orchard. Yet danger lurked in every bite. Dental care in the Middle Ages was rudimentary at best, with toothaches often solved by extractions done in marketplaces to the horror and amusement of the crowd. Dried fruit, with its sticky sugars lodging in cracks and crevices, was the enemy disguised as friend. Chewing raisins might leave behind sweetness, but it also left fuel for decay that could end in sleepless nights and swollen jaws. Still, people reached for more, because the human desire for candy has always been stronger than the warning voice of common sense. Merchants built fortunes on this hunger. Trade routes carried figs and dates from the Mediterranean to northern Europe, packed tightly in barrels and wrapped against damp. The very presence of these fruits in a household signaled connections, wealth, and access. A noble who could serve raisins in winter showed off more than generosity. He showed off power, the ability to reach across distance and draw sweetness into his hall. For peasants, even a handful of raisins folded into a loaf of bread transformed it into something festive, a reminder that life could be more than labor and thin gruel. Children, of course, adored dried fruit, gnawing on sticky prunes or squabbling over figs. Parents doled them out sparingly, mindful both of cost and of the digestive results. But on feast days or fairs, candied bread studded with raisins made its appearance, a treat so sweet it felt miraculous. In monasteries, where fasting and discipline shaped daily life, dried fruit slipped into recipes that balanced piety with comfort. Figs boiled with wine, raisins scattered in spiced cakes, dates pressed into loaves as though holiness and indulgence could share a table without quarreling. The sensory side of dried fruit was part of its appeal. Tear open a fig, and the inside gleamed with seeds, glistening like treasure. Bite into a date, and it clung to your teeth with caramel-like insistence. Chew a raisin, and it gave more sweetness than its size promised. Even the prune, often mocked, carried a depth of flavor that was earthy and satisfying when stewed with spices. Each bite was small, but the impression lingered, much like modern candy does when hidden in a child's pocket. There was also a practical reason for their popularity. Dried fruits kept. In an era before refrigeration, food preservation was survival, and a sack of raisins or figs could outlast fresh produce by months. That endurance made them precious for voyages, pilgrimages, and campaigns. Crusaders chewed dates between battles, sailors gnawed raisins on deck, and travelers tucked figs into packs as comfort against the uncertainty of the road. The portability of dried fruit made it more than candy. It was insurance, edible proof that sweetness could travel. And yet, for all their function, they never lost their reputation as indulgence. You could eat bread because you must, pottage because you had no choice, but you ate dried fruit because you wanted to. That want carried weight. It meant that even in a harsh world, people carved out space for pleasure, for sticky fingers and aching teeth, for the momentary thrill of chewing something that tasted like sunshine concentrated into flesh. So when you think of medieval candy, don't imagine shiny wrappers or factory lines. Imagine instead a fig, wrinkled but glistening, passed across a table like treasure. Imagine raisins folded into bread as a gift to children, dates nibbled slowly in a noble hall, prunes eaten with both delight and dread. It was candy with consequences, sweetness with a shadow. Chewy, sticky, and sometimes deadly to molars, dried fruit was proof that the craving for indulgence has always been worth the risk. Imagine a banquet hall glowing with candlelight, tables groaning beneath roasted meats, spiced wines, and trenchers piled with pies. Amid this abundance, a dish arrives that makes even the jaded noble straighten in his chair. Small gleaming pieces of fruit, translucent from boiling, laid out like jewels. This was succat, candied fruit boiled into submission, and it was less about satisfying hunger than about displaying wealth. To eat it was to participate in theater, each bite a statement that sugar was not just sweetener, but status crystallized. The making of succat was laborious and extravagant. Fruit was peeled, sliced, or left whole, then simmered over and over in thick sugar syrups until it absorbed the sweetness and transformed into something far removed from its natural state. Oranges became glossy, citron hardened into luminous slabs, ginger cubes sparkled with syrup that clung to fingers like resin. Each stage consumed costly sugar, a commodity that traveled by ship across oceans and demanded entire economies to produce. Sugar was medicine, spice, and treasure all at once, and pouring it into fruit was the medieval equivalent of setting money on fire just to watch it glitter. This extravagance meant succat was the preserve of the wealthy. Nobles used it to punctuate banquets, laying it out on trenchers or presenting it in ornate silver dishes. Guests plucked pieces delicately, savoring both the taste and the implication. Here was a household rich enough to take fruit, already valuable, and then drown it in sugar until it became candy. For those seated in the hall, each bite was as much a performance as a pleasure, proof that the host's coffers ran deep and his connections stretched across trade routes. Sugar-coated fruit wasn't food. It was edible theater, but it wasn't just show. To bite into succat was to experience a kind of sensory excess rare in the medieval world. The fruit, boiled until its own flavor concentrated, mingled with the sharp edge of sugar, creating something both familiar and alien. A slice of candied orange shocked with bitterness under its crust of sweetness. A piece of citron chewed like perfumed leather, fragrant and lasting. Ginger cubes burst with fire, the heat softened only slightly by syrup. These were not background flavors. They demanded attention, sparking conversations and wrinkling faces in delight or surprise. The health claims surrounding Suck-It gave it another layer of appeal. Sugar was still considered medicinal, prescribed for stomach troubles and melancholy. Fruit preserved this way was not only indulgence, but also remedy, handed around after heavy feasts to ease digestion. Nobles could nibble a sliver of candied ginger and pretend they were balancing humors rather than flaunting extravagance. That convenient overlap, luxury disguised as medicine, helped cement Suck-It's place in the banquet hall. It was indulgence you could justify, and yet, for all its glory, Suck-It also carried the shadows of excess. Too much sugar was as destructive then as now, rotting teeth that were already brittle from rough bread and poor hygiene. Archaeologists have found skeletons of the wealthy with mouths riddled by cavities, a reminder that indulgence left its marks. But no one at the time could resist. To eat Suck-It was to taste wealth. And what good was wealth if you didn't chew it until it hurt? For those outside noble circles, Suck-It was almost mythic. Peddlers might sell small bits at fairs, scraps of candied peel wrapped in paper, tiny tastes of a luxury, usually locked in castles. Merchants could occasionally afford it, especially those tied to the spice and sugar trades, but for peasants, it remained a dream, glimpsed only at festivals or in rumors. The idea of fruit turned into candy carried a kind of magic, a transformation that mirrored the fantasies of turning lead into gold. Suck-It was alchemy for the tongue. The preparation itself became an art form, one that demanded patience and a tolerance for danger. Sugar had to be boiled over open flames, stirred without burning, reduced to syrups that could blister skin in an instant. To candy fruit meant risking pain, but the result justified the risk. Kitchens filled with the smell of caramelizing sugar, the hiss of fruit hitting syrup, the sticky chaos of dripping trays. Servants endured the hazards, nobles enjoyed the spectacle, and the end result gleamed on silver plates as if conjured from another world. What lingers about Suck-It is its role as symbol. It was never meant to feed hunger. It was meant to dazzle, to remind every guest and servant that the lord at the head of the table controlled wealth that stretched beyond the village, beyond the kingdom, out into the world of spice roots and sugar plantations. Each bite was proof of reach, power, and connection. Even today, when candied fruit might seem quaint or outdated, the medieval Suck-It whispers of a time when sweetness itself was luxury, and to eat it was to bite into privilege. So when you picture Suck-It, don't imagine humble fruit confections wrapped in holiday tins. Imagine instead a medieval hall, tapestries flickering with torchlight, nobles leaning forward to pluck candied orange slices with jeweled fingers. Imagine servants wincing at the burns on their hands from the boiling syrup. Imagine sugar, dearer than gold, poured recklessly into pots until fruit surrendered, transformed into glossy, chewy relics of wealth. It was candied luxury for the nobility, proof that in the Middle Ages, sugar was not merely a flavor, but a declaration of status, boiled down and eaten one sticky bite at a time. The smell of frying fat and pastry drifted through medieval marketplaces like a beacon, calling to the hungry with the promise of something warm, savory, and portable. These were the meat pasties, humble pies, folded into crescents or rounds, their crusts browned from the heat of an oven or a pan of glowing coals. They were not elegant dishes, not meant to impress with artistry, but to satisfy the gnawing hunger of workers, travelers, and soldiers on the move. Bite into one and you might find venison, rabbit, pork, pigeon, or, if times were lean and desperation high, even hedgehog. The beauty of the pasty was its mystery. You never quite knew what you were getting until your teeth met the filling. The crust was more than just a vessel. It was a shield. Flour, water, maybe a bit of fat if luck allowed, rolled into a casing that sealed in meat and kept it moist while it cooked. In some regions, the crust was thick and inedible, meant to be thrown away after the meal, its only purpose to protect the food inside from dirt and soot. In others, the crust was thinner, flaky, and greasy, eaten along with the filling. Either way, the design made the pasty a marvel of practicality. Workers could carry it to the fields, soldiers to the battlefield, travelers on the road. A meal wrapped in its own container, resistant to dust and handling, ready whenever hunger struck. It was, in every sense, the medieval hot pocket. Inside, anything was fair game. Rich households filled pasties with venison or beef, seasoned with herbs and even rare spices. They might be served at feasts, cut open to reveal steaming meat, gravy pooling onto trenchers of bread. But in the hands of common folk, the filling depended on what could be caught, bought, or begged. Pigeon trapped from the rafters, scraps of pork salted and revived in the pie, eels or fish from nearby rivers, or, yes, even hedgehogs, skinned and roasted, their meat tucked inside dough. The pasty was not picky. It democratized meat, stretching small portions further, hiding questionable cuts in the comfort of grease and pastry. The eating of a pasty was an experience in itself. First came the heat, scalding enough to make you juggle the pie from hand to hand. Then the smell hit you, savory steam wafting out as the crust cracked open. Finally, the bite, crust yielding to meat, juices soaking into the pastry, a satisfying blend of chew and flavor. For the hungry, it was bliss, a meal you could eat with one hand while still working or walking. For the cautious, it was suspense, each bite revealing whether the cook had been generous with meat or patted it out with onions and oats. The mystery was part of the charm and also part of the risk. Taverns thrived on selling pasties. They lined them up on trays, steaming under low beams, each pie a cheap draw for travelers looking to drink. Market stalls sizzled with them, grease dripping as sellers barked their wares. Even fairs smelled of pasties mixed with smoke and sweat, the scent pulling crowds like moths to flame. They were affordable enough to be common, but versatile enough to be special, a bridge between necessity and indulgence. In their portability and greasy comfort, they were the snack of the streets, as essential to medieval snacking culture as ale itself. But the pasty had another side, one less savory. Because it was enclosed, it could hide. Spoiled meat, old scraps, fillers. Anything could be tucked inside dough and passed off as a bargain meal. Unscrupulous cooks relied on the crust to disguise sins, and buyers took their chances. Sometimes the gamble paid off, sometimes it didn't, but hunger often outweighed caution. Complaints show up in records. Bakers fined for selling pies with less meat than promised. Tavern keepers punished for fillings unfit for human stomachs. The authorities tried to regulate, but the appetite for pasties was too strong to ever stamp out the shady side of the trade. Still, the reputation of the pasty endured, not only as street food but as comfort food. Miners in later centuries carried them into the depths of the earth, their thick crusts marked with initials, still warm hours later when the break bell rang. That tradition had its roots here, in the Middle Ages, where portability mattered more than presentation, and the crust was both wrapping and safety net. Even when the filling disappointed, the act of holding a warm pie in your hand carried comfort of its own. The meat pasty was not glamorous, but it was vital. It bridged gaps between classes, appearing in different guises at both peasant fairs and noble tables. It kept laborers on their feet, soldiers on the march, and merchants on the road. It embodied the medieval spirit of practicality, blended with indulgence, survival flavored with grease. To unwrap one was to accept both risk and reward, to hope for venison and settle for hedgehog, to taste the savory heart of medieval junk food culture. In the end, the meat pasty's mystery was its strength. Each bite was a gamble, each pie a story, each filling a glimpse into the fortune or poverty of its maker. Sometimes bliss, sometimes disappointment, always greasy, always filling. A portable feast, a hidden secret, a medieval hot pocket steaming with history. The smell hit first. A briny punch of ocean tang mixed with the unmistakable reek of hot lard. It clung to cloaks and hair, lingered in stalls long after the brazier went cold, and could probably be detected by gulls wheeling half a mile away. This was the scent of fried fish skin cracklings, the snack born from thrift, necessity, and an unwillingness to waste a single edible scrap. To modern ears, it might sound like punishment food, something scraped from the bottom of a fryer when nothing else remained. But in medieval markets, it was considered an honest treat, crispy, salty, and addictive in a way only the desperate could truly appreciate. Fish was already everywhere in the medieval diet, demanded by fasting rules that stretched over half the calendar and reinforced by the church's suspicion of meat. Cod, herring, eel, and whatever else could be salted, dried, or smoked were eaten in staggering quantities. But for every fillet or dried slab, there were the skins, slippery and tough, destined for discard unless someone clever enough decided to drop them in hot fat. The transformation was almost alchemical, slick and unappealing. When raw, they turned golden, and crackling when fried, curling into crisp shapes that shattered between teeth. Waste turned to snack in a heartbeat. The cracklings weren't just resourceful. They were practical. Fat was precious and rarely wasted, but when you had a pot of it already bubbling for fritters or pies, slipping in some fish skin took little effort. The result was light, portable, and quick to serve, ideal for markets where people wanted something to eat without stopping their errands. For taverns, it was an easy companion to mugs of ale, salt sharpening thirst and keeping customers drinking. And for families near coasts or rivers, it was a way to stretch food further, ensuring nothing went uneaten in lean times. In an age where famine was always a shadow on the horizon, efficiency and indulgence sometimes looked exactly the same. Eating them was its own strange ritual. The first crunch echoed with satisfaction, like biting through brittle parchment. But immediately your tongue was hit with the mingling of salt, grease, and lingering sea. Some compared it to chewing Poseidon's laundry. Strong, fishy, insistent. But somehow it kept you coming back. The aftertaste clung, coating the mouth in brine and oil, demanding either another bite or a swift chaser of ale. And that was the genius of the crackling. It was snack and bait at once, luring you into more drinks, more coins, more indulgence than you intended. For the poor, fried fish skin was survival dressed as a treat. A few pennies could buy a small bag, enough to keep a worker chewing through the afternoon or to quiet children whining after long hours at market. For the rich, it was less common, but even they sometimes nibbled them in taverns or at fairs, curiosity overcoming snobbery. The real distinction was not who ate them, but how they were framed. Peasants treated them as food, nobles as novelty. That gap only widened the crackling's charm, proof that even the scraps of one man's meal could become another man's guilty pleasure. There was, of course, the hazard of freshness. Fish skins spoiled quickly if not cooked at once, and a stallholder with more greed than care might fry old skins and pass them off to unsuspecting buyers. The resulting stomach aches were legendary, fueling the suspicion that cheap snacks were always a gamble. Yet demand never slackened. People knew the risks, but the lure of grease and crunch outweighed fear. After all, most of life was a gamble then. Why should food be different? The sound of frying was part of the attraction. In busy markets, with pigs squealing and hawkers shouting, the sizzle of skins hitting hot fat cut through the noise. People drifted toward it instinctively, drawn by the combination of sound and smell. Children darted forward to watch the skins curl and crisp, their eyes wide at the transformation. Sellers shouted their wares, promising freshness, exaggerating size, and always handing out the product in greasy wraps that left fingers shining. Eating was public, messy, communal. Cracklings were not food you savored in silence. They were food you shared, laughed over, and licked from your hands while standing in a crowd. If you trace the spirit of junk food, fried fish skin embodies it perfectly. Cheap, quick, flavorful to the point of excess, unhealthy in large quantities, and yet utterly irresistible. It didn't pretend to be noble fare, didn't masquerade as healthful or refined. It was scraps, fried into something better, designed to please the senses before it ever nourished the body. And that honesty made it popular, even when jokes were made about the smell, about the taste that lingered hours after eating. The cracklings endured because they gave pleasure in a world where pleasure was scarce. So imagine yourself on a damp medieval street, cloak heavy with rain, stomach rumbling. You catch a whiff of briny smoke and follow it to a stall where strips of fish skin dance in bubbling lard. You pay a coin, take a hot handful, and bite. The crunch fills your ears, the salt floods your tongue, and for a moment, despite the mud and the cold and the endless grind of the day, you feel satisfied. That was the promise of fried fish skin cracklings. Waste turned wonder, scraps turned solace, the sea itself fried into something you could hold in your hand. The eel was never meant to be glamorous, and yet somehow in the Middle Ages it achieved stardom. Slippery, boneless, and strange to modern tastes, it slithered its way into the hearts and stomachs of everyone from monks cloistered in silence to kings sprawled in feasting halls. Fried eel was the superstar snack, beloved because it was versatile, filling, and, most importantly, conveniently classified as fish. In a world where church law dictated when you could and could not eat meat, eels slipped neatly through the fasting loopholes, ensuring they appeared on tables far more often than pork or beef ever did. The appeal started with practicality. Eels were abundant in rivers and estuaries, particularly in England, where their wriggling bodies filled the Thames and countless smaller streams. They could be trapped in wicker baskets or netted with little expense, stored alive for days in damp tubs, and transported long distances without spoiling. Unlike other fish, which stiffened or rotted quickly, eels stayed alive until you needed them, making them a living pantry of protein. For peasants who couldn't count on steady access to meat, an eel caught in the river was a blessing. For nobles, eels provided an indulgence that carried none of the stigma of breaking religious fasts. Everyone, regardless of rank, found reasons to praise them. But practicality alone doesn't make a superstar. It was in the frying pan that eels truly earned their fame. Cut into sections, rolled in flour or dipped in batter, then fried in hot lard or oil, they curled and sizzled, transforming from sleek water dwellers into crisp, savory bites. The skin crackled, the flesh softened, and the rich, almost meaty flavor lingered long after. Unlike delicate fish that flaked into nothing, eel offered substance. Bite into a fried piece and you got chew and oil, a satisfying density that could rival pork without the guilt of breaking holy rules. That density made it the perfect medieval junk food, greasy, hearty, and just dangerous enough to feel indulgent. Taverns leaned on fried eel as a staple, serving it alongside mugs of ale to keep patrons anchored to their benches. The saltiness of the meat sharpened thirst, and the grease demanded more drink to wash it down. Street vendors fried eels over open braziers, their stalls perfumed with the unmistakable aroma of sizzling fish, drawing crowds like moths to flame. Even monasteries, despite their vows of simplicity, consumed them eagerly on fasting days, justified by the neat classification of eel as fish rather than flesh. To chew eel was to obey God, while still enjoying something dangerously close to indulgence. The association between eels and religious life ran deeper still. In some regions, peasants paid rents and tithes in barrels of live eels, so prized were they by landlords and monasteries. A basket of eels was currency, tribute, and delicacy rolled into one. And since fried eel was a delicacy that could be eaten without guilt during Lent and Advent, it became almost a seasonal symbol, the star dish of holy times that otherwise stripped tables of meat. People clung to it, not only for the taste, but for the loophole it represented. Obedience flavored with defiance. Of course, not everyone praised the smell. Fried eel carried an unmistakable odor, pungent enough to linger in tavern rafters and cling to clothes. Jokes about eel breath peppered the culture, and children sometimes wrinkled their noses at the sight of yet another greasy plate. But even detractors admitted that it filled bellies like few other fish could, and once the first bite cracked between your teeth, resistance faded quickly. The crisp skin gave way to rich flesh, oily and savory, in a way that few medieval snacks could match. That was the eel's greatest trick. It offended until it seduced. In noble halls, fried eel appeared on platters alongside roasted meats, not as a humble filler but as a delicacy in its own right. Recipes called for seasoning with pepper, ginger, or saffron, spicing the meat until it gleamed with flavor as well as fat. Cookbooks recorded elaborate variations. Eel pies, eel stews, even eel fritters. But frying remained the simplest and most beloved method. It didn't need gilding to shine. The crunch and chew spoke for themselves, bridging the gap between the riverbank and the banquet table. The eel's story is one of survival and adaptation. It swam through rivers and into nets, through frying pans and onto tables, across class divides and church rules. It was beloved by peasants because it was cheap and abundant. It was beloved by nobles because it was rich and adaptable. It was beloved by monks because it was fish and therefore holy day approved, even when fried in decadent fat. Few foods managed to charm such a broad spectrum of society. So when you think of fried eel, don't imagine dainty bites served with lemon wedges. Picture instead the medieval tavern, smoke rising from a brazier, grease popping in a pan, and strips of eel curling into crisp, salty crescents. Picture the noble feast where a platter of golden pieces gleamed in candlelight beside roasted venison. Picture the monk chewing contentedly during Lent, savoring the loophole. Fried eel was the slippery superstar, thriving precisely because it straddled the line between necessity and indulgence, sin and obedience, riverbank and frying pan. It was everything medieval junk food needed to be: greasy, filling, and impossible to resist. The first thing to understand about blood pudding balls is that they were not designed to be subtle. They were fried, heavy, unapologetic spheres of oats and animal blood that looked like something cooked up on a dare and then kept around because they actually worked. The idea was simple. When you slaughtered an animal, you wasted nothing, and that included the blood. Mixed with grains, onions, herbs if you could spare them, and sometimes suet or scraps of fat, the result was a batter dark as ink, thickened into clumps and dropped sizzling into hot grease. Out came balls that were crisp on the outside, tender on the inside, and unmistakably iron-rich, a flavor both primal and slightly alarming. Blood had always been part of medieval diets, not because people were morbid, but because scarcity demanded it. Throwing away blood after a slaughter would have been considered wasteful, almost sinful. It was protein, it was minerals, it was calories waiting to be transformed. So, blood pudding, what later generations would call black pudding, was a staple in many parts of Europe, and the ball-shaped version made it portable, snackable, and perfect for fairs, taverns, or field work. These were not elegant delicacies, but dense fuel for bodies that labored from dawn to dusk. A few bites could carry a man through another hour of swinging a scythe or hauling stones, though he might taste iron on his tongue the whole time. The frying gave them their charm. Without that layer of grease and crunch, blood pudding could feel daunting, loose, sticky, unyielding. But when rolled into spheres and dropped into bubbling fat, something changed. They crisped and darkened, forming a shell that broke open to reveal the soft, steaming core inside. That contrast between crunch and chew was addictive. The smell, however, was more divisive. Hot blood mixed with fat produced a rich, metallic aroma that either lured or repelled, depending on how hungry you were. To some, it was a comfort, a smell tied to slaughter days and full bellies. To others, it was a reminder of mortality served in a bowl. Eating one was always a test of will. The first bite demanded courage, teeth sinking through crisp shell into something darker, moister, with that unmistakable tang of iron. Some people gagged, others fell in love, and once you learned to appreciate it, the flavor grew on you. Savory, hearty, heavy, touched with herbs and oats, a taste that filled your stomach and clung to your memory. It was the kind of snack that made you feel stronger, even if it only made you greasier. Taverns loved blood pudding balls because they paired so well with ale. The salt and fat magnified thirst, the chew kept drinkers occupied, and the shock value gave them a talking point. Travelers bought them from market stalls for the same reason. They were cheap, filling, and portable, easy to wrap in cloth and carry along the road. Children sometimes ate them too, though not without hesitation, their faces smeared with grease as they gnawed suspiciously at the dark centers. In some regions, they were even considered festive food, tied to the autumn slaughter when livestock were culled for winter and fresh blood was plentiful. That meant these snacks carried both celebration and survival in their flavor. There was danger in them, of course. Improperly prepared blood could sour quickly, turning pudding balls into vectors of illness rather than nourishment. Cooks needed to move fast, mixing and frying soon after slaughter, or risk poisoning the very people they were feeding. The frying oil itself could betray them, often reused to the point of rancidity, so that the balls carried notes of last week's fish along with their iron tang. But again, hunger dulled caution. People ate what was set before them, prayed it would sit well in their bellies, and if it did, returned for more. Socially, blood pudding balls blurred boundaries. Nobles might sneer at their coarseness, but even they indulged in versions seasoned with rare spices, cut neatly into slices rather than rolled into rustic spheres. Peasants embraced them more openly, proud of their efficiency and hardiness. To eat them was to declare resilience, to take what others might discard and turn it into something sustaining. They were food of necessity, yet they carried their own defiant pleasure. The symbolism of eating blood was never lost on medieval people. Blood was life. Blood was vitality. Blood was sacred and dangerous. To swallow it fried into a ball was to consume strength, to claim energy directly from the animal. It was culinary sorcery, turning something visceral into nourishment. That lent the snack a kind of daring, as though each bite was a pact between eater and beast. So imagine a medieval street on slaughter day, the gutters still running red, the air thick with smoke and steam. In a nearby tavern, a cook is dropping dark spheres into a pan of hissing fat, pulling them out one by one, crisp and hot, stacking them onto platters. Laborers crowd in, coins exchanged, hands reaching, mouths opening. The first bite is tentative, the second more confident, the third taken with gusto. Outside, the cold wind cuts, but inside, bellies are warm with fried blood and ale. Blood pudding balls were iron-rich dare food, frightening to some, beloved by others, always filling, always greasy, always memorable. They asked you to be brave, and they rewarded you with sustenance. They embodied medieval junk food at its most raw, practical, risky, indulgent, and just a little terrifying. Picture the medieval hearth at dawn, fire coaxed back to life with smoke curling low across the rafters and a pan of lard set to heat until it spat and hissed. Into that shimmering fat went a thin ladle of batter. Nothing fancy, just flour, water, and maybe an egg if fortune smiled. The edges bubbled, the center set, and within moments a pancake was born, chewy, greasy, and ready to be folded in half and eaten by anyone with hands free. This was not the fluffy stack of maple-drizzled breakfasts we imagine today. These were survival cakes, fried flat until morale improved. Simple discs that carried both comfort and calories in a world where food was rarely either. The genius of medieval pancakes was their adaptability. At their most basic, they were flour and water, poor man's food that could be fried up even in times of famine. But given the right additions, they transformed. Drop in some milk, and you had richness. Stir in eggs, and you had substance. Fold in apples or raisins, and suddenly you had a sweet treat worthy of a fair stall. Toss in onions, herbs, or scraps of meat, and you had a savory meal in portable form. The pancake absorbed whatever life offered, good or bad, and turned it into something edible. It was culinary resilience, embodied in a circle of fried dough. The cooking fat mattered almost as much as the batter. Lard was the staple, kept in earthenware jars, reused until it carried the memory of everything it had ever fried. That gave pancakes a depth of flavor both comforting and questionable. Sometimes they carried the ghost of last week's fish, other times the hint of onions or pork. To the hungry, this layering of flavors was a bonus, a reminder of meals past folded into the present. To the less hungry, it was an acquired taste, but grease was essential. It crisped the edges, kept the cake from sticking, and made every bite feel indulgent even when the ingredients were meager. Street vendors thrived on them. Picture a crowded market square, the air already heavy with smoke and dung, and the sudden sizzle from a hot griddle as batter hit fat. That sound drew people in, the promise of something hot, cheap, and ready in seconds. Pancakes could be handed over, wrapped in a scrap of cloth or on a wooden trencher, eaten while walking, crumbs falling into the mud. They were the perfect medieval fast food, quick to make, quick to eat, and quick to sell. And because batter could be stretched endlessly, they were profitable too, a way for vendors to turn a little flour into a lot of coins. Taverns, too, leaned heavily on pancakes. They served as drinking companions, their salt and fat encouraging customers to order more ale. Sometimes they were stacked with cheese or soaked in broth, other times eaten plain, fingers greasy and mouths full. Travelers on the road could expect them at inns, sometimes sweetened with honey if the innkeeper felt generous, sometimes thickened with peas or lentils when grain was scarce. They were endlessly flexible, a dish that could be dressed up for a feast or stripped down to the barest minimum in lean times. But pancakes were not only about hunger. They carried ritual and symbolism as well. Shrove Tuesday became famous for them, the day before Lent, when households emptied their stores of fat, eggs, and dairy by frying them into stacks of pancakes. It was indulgence before denial, a last greasy gasp of pleasure before the long fast. Whole villages smelled of them, pans sizzling as neighbors traded bites, children licking honey from their fingers, adults knowing that tomorrow the feast would end. The pancake was both celebration and farewell, a reminder that food could be joyful before it returned to being austere. For the poor, pancakes were sometimes the only treat available, a rare chance to taste sweetness when drizzled with honey or dotted with fruit. For the wealthy, they became canvases for excess, spiced with cinnamon, saffron, or nutmeg, layered with sugar imported at staggering cost. A pancake at a noble table was no longer survival food but a demonstration of wealth, proof that something so common could be elevated with expensive adornments. Yet at their core, whether eaten from silver plates or bare hands, pancakes were the same, fried discs of dough that filled stomachs and soothed spirits. Eating one was always a small act of comfort. The first bite, still hot from the pan, softened the edges of a hard day. The chewiness gave weight, the grease gave flavor, and for a few moments, hunger stopped gnawing. Even when burnt at the edges or made from rough flour that tasted of grit, they were still better than nothing, still proof that a little ingenuity could transform scraps into satisfaction. And in that way, pancakes were more than food. They were morale. So when you think of medieval pancakes, don't imagine neat stacks with syrup dripping down their sides. Imagine instead a smoky kitchen with a mother flipping batter in reused lard while children wait, eyes wide. Imagine a vendor in a market stall, frying disc after disc for laborers who need something hot to hold against the cold. Imagine a tavern where ale sloshes and pancakes vanish as quickly as they are fried. Thin, chewy, endlessly adaptable, they were grease-fried survival, proof that even in the hardest times, people sought out warmth, comfort, and the simple joy of something fried golden in a pan. Imagine a medieval fairground at dusk, the air thick with wood smoke and the shouts of hawkers, and in the middle of it all a basket of pale, irregular nuggets being passed around. They squeak faintly when bitten, chewy and salty, and oddly comforting, nothing fancy, yet utterly satisfying. These were cheese curds, the medieval equivalent of popcorn, a snack that could be stuffed into a pouch, shared in a crowd, or eaten idly while listening to a wandering minstrel. They were small, portable, and, in a world where bread might mold and fruit might rot, they were reliable in a way few foods ever were. Cheese curds were essentially the beginning of cheese itself, the fresh solids formed when milk was curdled and separated from whey. Most curds would eventually be pressed, salted, and aged into the wheels and blocks that filled larders and cellars, but some never made it that far. Instead, they were eaten fresh, soft, and squeaky, little bites of milk turned solid. They required no elaborate preparation beyond the initial curdling, which meant they appeared in households across classes, from farm kitchens where milk was plentiful, to monastic kitchens where dairying was an essential craft. If milk was life, curds were its simplest expression, tangible proof of survival you could hold in your hand. Their portability made them perfect as a snack. Wrapped in cloth, they could be tucked into a satchel or carried on the road, ready for a quick bite between tasks. Market sellers handed them out by the handful, sometimes salted, sometimes flavored with herbs. Children nibbled them like candy, peasants chewed them for energy in the fields, and travelers gnawed them to stave off hunger until they reached the next tavern. Unlike meat, they required no killing, unlike bread, no baking, and unlike fruit, no season. They were steady, dependable, always waiting in the churn or the bucket whenever hunger struck. But curds weren't only about practicality. They were also about pleasure. The squeak, when bitten, gave them novelty, a playful texture that entertained even when flavor was plain. Their saltiness was addictive, their chew satisfying in a way that left you reaching for another. In a hall or a tavern, they served the same role as a bowl of nuts or a basket of chips. Something to share, to keep hands busy and mouths occupied while conversation or music filled the room. The ease of curds made them communal, food without ceremony, eaten quickly and without thought, yet never without joy. Monasteries understood their value, producing curds in abundance not just for themselves but for sale, turning milk into a currency as well as a meal. Peasant families relied on them during times when aging cheese wasn't practical or possible. For nobles, curds might arrive, flavored with expensive spices, or served fried in butter as a delicacy, dressed up to show refinement. But no matter how they appeared, plain or adorned, eaten by the handful, or served on silver, they carried the same essence, a snack born of necessity that delighted anyway. The reliability of curds was part of their magic. In a world where famine was always possible, curds were a promise. Milk turned solid meant calories stored, a safety net in uncertain times. Even when aged cheese failed or spoiled, curds could still be eaten fresh. That sense of assurance mattered, because so little else in medieval diets could be counted on to be both safe and enjoyable. You could not always guarantee clean water, ripe fruit, or edible meat, but you could trust the curd to be ready, simple, and nourishing. They also paired effortlessly with other foods. Dipped in honey, they became a sweet indulgence. Fried in lard, they turned into golden bites of grease-laden comfort. Mixed into pies or stews, they melted slightly, adding richness to otherwise thin fare. But even without embellishment, the plain curd carried its own appeal. the pure taste of milk concentrated into a bite-sized form. That purity gave it a kind of humble luxury, accessible yet satisfying, modest yet complete. Eating curds was not glamorous, but it was grounding. They were food you could trust, a little burst of steadiness in a world where nothing else was guaranteed. The fact that they squeaked between your teeth was almost a reminder not to take survival too seriously, that even in hunger there could be play. And so curds found their place as medieval popcorn, shared in fairs, scattered in taverns, munched on roadsides, carried in pockets, eaten with laughter. So when you imagine medieval cheese curds, don't picture neon orange cubes or battered fried bites on a modern menu. Picture a cloth pouch of pale lumps, pulled out by a laborer during a break, or handed across a tavern table as minstrels play. Picture children chewing them in the sun, monks weighing them in markets, nobles seasoning them with spice. They were squeaky, portable, and reliable, tiny anchors of comfort in a world that had precious little certainty, and that reliability is what made them beloved. They were medieval popcorn, a snack you could count on when nothing else was steady, a bite of stability that squeaked back at you. The turnip never asked to be dessert. Yet in the Middle Ages it was pressed into that role with all the desperation of a poor actor shoved on stage in the wrong costume. Grain was scarce, sugar was rarer still, and honey could not sweeten every craving, so cooks turned to the most humble root at hand, the turnip. When stewed or boiled, it was earthy, fibrous, and filling, but dressed with spices, mixed with milk or eggs, and baked in a crust, it was coaxed into pretending it belonged on the same table as puddings and pies. Thus was born the turnip pie, a dish less about flavor than about denial, the triumph of pretending that necessity could be indulgence. The preparation was deceptively hopeful. Turnips were peeled, boiled until tender, then mashed into a pale pulp that smelled faintly of damp earth. To this were added whatever luxuries could be spared: milk if there was any, eggs if the hens were generous, butter if a cow had been milked. Some cooks stirred in cinnamon, nutmeg, or ginger, spices so costly they were usually reserved for feasts, in an effort to disguise the root's stubborn bitterness. Poured into a pastry shell, or sometimes just baked plain, the pie emerged golden at the edges, steaming and fragrant, a false promise of sweetness. From a distance, it looked like custard or cheesecake. Up close, the illusion faltered, but still, people tried to believe. For peasants, turnip pie was not a joke, but a survival strategy. Roots stored well through winter, and when grain ran short, they were the only dependable filler. A pie made from turnips could stand in for something more festive at holidays, a way of marking time when larders were otherwise bare. Children were told it was pudding, and sometimes the lie worked, at least for a few bites. Parents smiled at the grimace, swallowed their own share, and insisted it was special food for a special day. The truth was that it filled bellies cheaply and quickly, which in an age of hunger was justification enough. Among the wealthy, turnip pie took on a different character. Spices masked its nature, honey or sugar sweetened its flesh, and almonds or dried fruit were sometimes folded in to elevate it into something closer to an actual dessert. In this form, it became a curiosity served at feasts, the kind of dish nobles could sample with laughter, remarking on the cleverness of making roots taste like pudding. Yet even gilded with spice and sugar, the root never completely disappeared. A faint bitterness always crept through, reminding diners that this was still a turnip in disguise, a pretender in silks. The taste was polarizing. Fresh from the oven, warm and spiced, a turnip pie could almost pass as pleasant. Almost. But as it cooled, the earthy undertone returned, stubborn and unmistakable, clinging to the tongue like a reminder of the field. Some found it comforting, a familiar flavor made gentler by sweetness. Others found it disappointing, a betrayal of the promises made by its smell. But whether loved or loathed, it was eaten, because choice was a luxury and waste was unthinkable. Taverns occasionally offered turnip pies when better fare was scarce, serving slices to customers who drowned any disappointment with ale. Markets sold them too, especially in lean seasons, where they stood beside oatcakes and boiled beans as proof of resilience. They were not bought for joy, but for sustenance disguised as joy, for the pretense that even the poorest could have something resembling dessert. And in that pretense, there was comfort. Turnip pies also carried a moral weight. Preachers praised frugality, praising those who made do with roots rather than demanding luxuries. Feasts built on meat and sugar could be condemned as gluttony, but a turnip pie was humble, modest, even virtuous. To eat it was to signal thrift and piety, especially in times of fasting when richer dishes were forbidden. Thus, the pie became more than food. It was a statement, a visible act of endurance and humility, even when everyone privately longed for something better. The irony, of course, is that in trying to be dessert, the turnip pie revealed both the ingenuity and the hardship of medieval life. It was a culinary mask, a dish that whispered of abundance while tasting of necessity. It was the human will to transform the plain into the pleasing, to insist on celebration even when resources argued otherwise. And that insistence, more than flavor, was what made it meaningful. So, when you imagine turnip pie, don't think of the neat, flaky pastries in glossy cookbooks. Picture instead a smoky kitchen, where a mother stirs mashed roots into a battered crust, smiling at her children and calling it pudding. Picture a tavern keeper setting out slices beside mugs of ale, the patrons chewing dutifully while joking about the lie. Picture a noble table where spices and sugar cloak the root in a costume, but never quite erase its bitterness. It was desperation masquerading as dessert, denial baked into a crust, and proof that even in scarcity, people clung to the illusion of sweetness. The first bite of a leek and onion paste was never subtle. It hit you square in the mouth, hot and pungent, filling your nose and clinging to your breath long after the last swallow. Yet despite its reputation for turning kisses sour and conversation rancid, this humble mash of roots and bulbs was one of the most beloved cheap snacks of the medieval world. It was quick to make, it cost next to nothing, and it had the uncanny ability to trick the stomach into thinking it was full. If fried fish skin was the street food of the coast and meat pasties belonged to fairs, then leek and onion paste was the universal filler, the kind of food that didn't care about elegance, only about getting you through the day. The recipe was simple, almost insultingly so. Chop leeks and onions into coarse chunks, soften them in a pan with fat or sometimes just water, then grind or mash them into a paste. A sprinkle of salt if you had it, a dash of herbs if you were fancy, and maybe some crumbs of bread stirred in to bulk it out. Spread onto a crust, ladled into a bowl, or eaten straight from the pan. It was a dish that went from raw to ready in minutes. The ingredients were cheap and omnipresent, thriving in cold soils where little else grew. Leeks stood stubborn in gardens through winter frost. Onions stored for months in dark sheds, waiting patiently until called upon. They were the workhorses of the medieval kitchen, and in paste form they showed their endurance. It was also food of contradictions. Hot and soft, it soothed an empty stomach like porridge, but its flavor was anything but gentle. Onions grew fiercer with heat, their sweetness undercut by sharpness, while leeks brought an earthy, almost grassy note. Together, they created a taste that was comforting in the moment yet punishing afterward. The smell seeped into hands and clothing, and no amount of ale seemed able to wash it from the breath. Lovers complained, neighbors laughed, and preachers warned against overindulgence. But still, people went back for more, because for all its side effects, leek and onion paste was filling, cheap and quick, and those virtues outweighed any regret. Street vendors capitalized on its popularity, selling ladles of the stuff at markets, sometimes spread on hard bread like a proto-sandwich, other times served in small bowls with a spoon. The scent alone was enough to draw a crowd, a mix of caramelized sweetness and biting onion that carried across squares. Taverns dished it up alongside ale, pairing bitterness with pungency in a marriage that made mouths water even as it made eyes water too. Laborers in fields carried simple jars of it, scooping bites on the go, while monks spooned more refined versions in cloisters, bolstered with herbs from their gardens. Its power to disguise hunger gave it special value during lean seasons. When grain ran low and meat was scarce, a pot of onions and leeks stretched into paste could feed a family. The sheer volume of it, spread across stale bread or mixed into porridge, created the illusion of abundance. It was not luxury, not even really pleasure, but it was sustenance wrapped in the fleeting joy of heat and grease. And in medieval kitchens, where survival was never guaranteed, that was enough. There were variations, of course. Nobles dressed up their versions with saffron, pepper, or even almond milk, turning the peasant paste into something resembling a delicate custard. They called it by fancier names, served it in silver dishes, and ate it with pride rather than apology. Yet the core never changed. Onions and leeks, softened, mashed, and eaten in quantity, rich or poor, everyone recognized it for what it was. A cheap filler in disguise, though dressed in noble houses as refinement and in peasant huts as necessity. The regret it left behind was legendary. Jokes about onion breath were common, and some even claimed it drove away demons as efficiently as lovers. Pilgrims who traveled long distances together learned quickly that anyone eating leek paste shared its aroma with the entire group. Children laughed at the smell. Adults sighed at its persistence, but all of them accepted it as part of life. Because when hunger gnawed, embarrassment mattered little. What made leek and onion paste endure was its universality. It was not tied to feast days, not limited by class, not bound by season. It was the medieval version of garlic fries. Bold, messy, impossible to hide, but also impossible to resist. Everyone knew it would leave its mark, but everyone ate it anyway. That balance between pleasure and consequence defined much of medieval snacking, and in leek and onion paste it found one of its purest expressions. So picture it: a smoky tavern, candles guttering, ale flowing, and bowls of steaming paste set on the table, scooped up with hunks of bread. Picture the street fair, where vendors stir bubbling pots, ladling portions for laughing customers who fan their faces against the pungent steam. Picture a peasant kitchen, a single pot of onions boiled into submission, children dipping crusts while their parents sigh at the smell. Quick, cheap, and pungent, it was the snack that smelled like regret but tasted like comfort, proof that sometimes survival and indulgence were one and the same. Pea porridge was never meant to impress anyone. Thick, greenish, and lumpy, it sat in bowls like mud scooped from a riverbank. Yet for all its plainness, it was one of the most important staples of medieval life. Cheap, filling, and easy to store, peas were protein disguised as monotony, eaten day after day in the form of porridge that could be reheated, stretched, and rebranded until it bore almost no resemblance to soup at all. By the time it hardened into a lump and was fried into cakes, it had even crossed into the realm of snack food, proving that hunger is the greatest motivator for culinary innovation. The rhyme about pea porridge hot, pea porridge cold wasn't exaggeration. It was daily reality. A pot of peas could be boiled one day, reheated the next, and scraped from the same pot on the third, congealing more with each cycle. Freshly made, it was soupy and steaming, spooned out with a ladle. After a night on the hearth, it thickened into something closer to clay. By the third or fourth day, it could be cut into hunks, fried on a pan, and eaten with fingers. That was the genius of peas. They kept evolving into new forms, offering the illusion of variety, when, in truth, it was the same food recycled endlessly. Lentils played the same role, a little less common in Northern Europe, but beloved where they grew. Their earthy taste and quicker cooking time made them practical, while their ability to mash smoothly made them prime candidates for cakes. Monks embraced lentils during fasting seasons, praising them as pious substitutes for meat, while peasants valued them as cheap sustenance that made heavy labor possible. When fried into cakes, lentils and peas became portable and even vaguely indulgent, a far cry from the endless drudgery of ladled porridge. The frying crisped their edges, gave them texture, and added that golden sheen of fat that turned survival food into something almost celebratory. Street vendors sold fried pea or lentil cakes as quick snacks, stacking them on trays, their surfaces bubbling with grease. They were eaten by travelers, workers, and children alike, often with nothing more than a sprinkle of salt or a smear of onion paste. Taverns served them alongside ale, a cheap way to fill stomachs while keeping the mugs flowing. Their appeal wasn't in refinement but in reliability. You always knew what you were getting, and you knew it would keep you full. In an age where famine hovered in the background, fullness was luxury enough. The taste was plain, earthy, a little nutty, sometimes improved with herbs or leeks, but never extravagant. The frying added most of the flavor, transforming bland legumes into chewy patties that hissed and popped in lard. Hot from the pan, they were satisfying, their crunch giving way to a dense, protein-rich interior. Cold, they could be carried in satchels, eaten on the road, or fed to children as snacks. They were as versatile as they were cheap, and in that versatility lay their quiet success. For the wealthy, legumes were less appealing, associated with peasant diets and austerity. Yet even nobles could not resist the occasional lentil or pea dish, especially during fasting periods when meat was forbidden. In those contexts, cooks elevated them with saffron, pepper, or vinegar, transforming the humble cakes into dishes worthy of silver platters. Still, no amount of spice could erase their essence. They remained food of necessity dressed in finery, reminders that even the highborn leaned on peas when the calendar demanded piety. The health reputation of peas and lentils gave them further staying power. They were praised as strengthening, easy to digest, and restorative, particularly when meat was unavailable. Physicians recommended them for their humoral balance, fitting them neatly into the medical worldview of the time. But ordinary people didn't need a physician to tell them why they mattered. A bowl of porridge or a handful of fried cakes gave energy for labor, and that was medicine enough. What makes pea porridge and lentil cakes so memorable is the way they embody medieval compromise. They were born of scarcity, yet managed to feel inventive, turning dull repetition into something edible, even comforting. They blurred the line between necessity and treat, reminding everyone that with a little fat and fire, even the humblest foods could aspire to pleasure. In their own way, they were medieval junk food, cheap, filling, fried, and eaten with greasy fingers, regret coming later when the taste lingered longer than you wished. So imagine a medieval kitchen, the pot of peas bubbling for the first time, ladled steaming into bowls. Picture it the next day, thicker, saltier, scraped from the pot with less enthusiasm. Then picture it on the third day, cut into slices and sizzling in a pan, suddenly transformed into something new. Imagine a market stall with trays of fried cakes, peas or lentils mashed into patties, sold for pennies to hungry crowds. This was protein on the cheap, legumes disguised as variety, survival rebranded as snack. It was proof that even monotony could be fried until it felt like something worth eating. Bread soaked in ale was the medieval equivalent of collapsing into bed with takeout after a long shift. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't refined, but it was easy, comforting, and reliable. At the end of a grueling day in the fields or at a workbench, a hunk of stale bread and a mug of ale could be transformed into something more filling by combining the two. The bread softened, the ale thickened, and what had once been dry, crumbs, or flat beer turned into a warm, soggy hybrid that felt more like a meal than either did alone. It was survival, dressed as comfort, a dish that required no skill, only hunger. This practice took several forms. Sometimes it was as simple as trench toast, slices of old bread toasted over the fire, then dipped in ale to soften them before being eaten. Other times it became soups, the liquid poured over chunks of bread in bowls until they swelled and disintegrated into a porridge-like mass. The variations were endless, depending on what could be added. A dash of fat or butter, some herbs, a shred of cheese, maybe an onion or two if luck held out. Each addition elevated the dish slightly, though the base remained the same. Ale and bread, the cornerstones of the medieval diet, colliding in a soggy embrace. The charm of bread and ale was not in its sophistication, but in its speed. After hours of work, no one wanted to wait for stews to simmer or meat to roast. Bread and ale were already on hand, and combining them required no labor beyond tearing, soaking, and swallowing. Laborers came home exhausted, dumped their bread into ale, and ate. Soldiers did the same in camp, using hard crusts softened in ale as their only comfort between battles. Even monks, bound by fasting rules, leaned on the combination as a way to stretch their rations without breaking discipline. The dish was universal, one of the few that crossed class boundaries, though it was the poor who depended on it most. The taste was strange but familiar. The ale brought bitterness, fizz, and a faint sweetness, while the bread softened into spongy lumps. Hot, it could be hearty and soothing, like a rustic pudding. Cold, it could be depressing, little more than mush, but hunger reshaped perception. To a tired laborer, even soggy bread carried the promise of rest. To a child with nothing else for supper, it was filling enough to quiet complaints. And to anyone with a hangover from too much ale the night before, it doubled as both cure and punishment. Taverns leaned into this need, offering trench toasts alongside their drinks, charging a small fee to transform yesterday's stale loaves into something edible. Market vendors sold soups in bowls, steaming in the cold air, the smell of malt and yeast mixing with wood smoke. For the poor, it was cheaper than meat pies or fritters, a penny's worth of sustenance that could be eaten quickly and carried away. For the tavern keepers, it was profit wrung from scraps, turning stale bread and flat ale into steady income. The dish's simplicity gave it a ritualistic quality. In some households, soaking bread in ale was a nightly practice, as routine as prayer. Children tore their bread into mugs, adults sipped from bowls, and for a few minutes the day's worries were drowned in soggy crumbs. Even nobles indulged in more refined versions, where wine might replace ale or spiced broths took the place of plain drink. Yet even at its fanciest, the heart of the dish remained unchanged. Bread softened in liquid, eaten because it was fast, filling, and inevitable. There was, of course, a stigma attached to it. Writers sometimes mocked the dish as food of the desperate, a mark of poverty or laziness. But those same critics often indulged in it when no one was looking. Hunger didn't care about pride, and comfort foods rarely do. In the end, bread soaked in ale endured because it worked. It filled stomachs, it warmed bodies, and it dulled the sharp edge of exhaustion. So when you picture bread soaked in ale, don't imagine a neat slice of toast dipped in craft beer. Imagine a muddy field, a laborer with blistered hands tearing crusts into a battered mug, watching them soften in the froth. Imagine a smoky tavern, bowls of soups passed out to patrons whose coins barely covered their drinks. Imagine children slurping mush while their parents pretended it was a treat. It was soggy but hearty, cheap but comforting, proof that even in a world of scarcity, people found ways to create small rituals of relief. Bread and ale, humble on their own, became solace together, the medieval comfort food for the tired and the poor. In the great halls of the nobility, where feasting was as much about spectacle as sustenance, few things captured the strange blend of indulgence and awkwardness, quite like sops in wine. At first glance, the dish was simple. Bread toasted, cut into manageable pieces, and dipped into spiced wine. But in the hands of nobles, it became an act of performance, a way to show off refinement, wealth, and a command over the table, all while trying not to let soggy crumbs fall into one's lap. It was toast dunked with dignity, an everyday act elevated into ritual. The foundation was bread, but not the rough brown loaves eaten by peasants. Nobles preferred white bread, made from sifted flour, softer and finer than anything the lower classes could afford. Toasting it over the fire gave it sturdiness, a necessary defense against collapse when introduced to liquid. The wine was no ordinary drink either. It was spiced, often with cinnamon, cloves, or ginger, each pinch a demonstration of wealth, since such spices traveled across continents and cost more than most families earned in a year. To dunk bread in wine was therefore not just a matter of taste, but a statement. We are so rich, we can afford to dissolve luxury into mush. The act itself carried theater. A noble would lift a slice, delicately toasted, dip it into the warm wine, and raise it carefully to their mouth. Too quick, and it dripped. Too slow, and it disintegrated, leaving them fishing for bread pulp, like a clumsy peasant. The balance was delicate, the gesture practiced, and the audience, because every noble meal was an audience affair, watched closely. To manage the sop with grace was to display refinement. To bungle it was to risk embarrassment. The sop was as much about proving composure as it was about filling one's stomach. The taste was undeniably indulgent. Toast absorbed the wine until it softened into spiced, boozy pudding. Each bite carried the heat of cinnamon, the sweetness of clove, the faint bitterness of charred bread, all laced with alcohol's warmth. It was rich, heavy, and comforting, the kind of food that didn't just fill but soothed. For nobles weighed down with endless courses of roasted meats and game pies, the sop was a gentle interlude, a palate cleanser that was also a status symbol. For anyone else, it was unimaginable extravagance. Yet this practice wasn't limited to palaces. Taverns offered humbler versions, with coarse bread dunked in cheap ale or weak wine. Laborers, too, soaked their crusts in broth or cider, a practical way to soften stale loaves and make them edible again. The difference was that peasants treated it as utility, while nobles turned it into ceremony. Bread and wine was survival in one world and performance in another. The contrast revealed how the same basic act, softening bread in liquid, could mean desperation at one table and elegance at another. Writers of the time sometimes mocked the nobles for their pretensions, noting how ridiculous it looked to treat soggy bread like a luxury. But no amount of satire stopped the practice. Sops, in wine, had staying power because it embodied what the medieval elite craved most: the ability to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, to insist that even toast could be elevated if dipped in wealth. And yet, beneath the show, the dish retained its comforting heart. Anyone who had eaten stale bread knew the relief of seeing it softened and made edible again. Anyone who had tasted wine knew the pleasure of warmth spreading through the body. Together, they became something greater than the sum of their parts. Nobles may have cloaked it in ceremony, but at its core, sops in wine were simply comforting, warm, soft, spiced, and sustaining. So picture the scene: a long table in a great hall, banners hanging, torches flaring. Nobles raise slices of toast, dipping them into steaming bowls of wine spiced with cinnamon and ginger. They eat slowly, carefully, trying not to drip, smiling at one another as though the act itself were poetry. It looks dignified, even elegant, but it is, at its heart, the same thing peasants do with stale crusts and broth in their cottages. It is toast and wine, dressed up for company, awkwardly elegant and deeply performative, yet undeniably comforting. It was nobles dunking with dignity, proving that even soggy bread could be transformed into spectacle when gilded with spice and ceremony. Spiced ale pudding was never going to win awards for beauty, but it had its own swagger. Imagine a mug of ale, already cloudy and sour with yeast, set to boil with spices pilfered from distant lands. Ginger, nutmeg, cinnamon, or whatever the cook could get away with tossing in. Then, when the pot bubbled and the kitchen filled with the smell of malt and heat, in went hunks of bread, broken by hand, crumbling into the liquid until it thickened into something halfway between porridge and sludge. This was liquid bread with attitude, warming and filling but also faintly grotesque, the kind of dish that dared you to call it anything less than food. Ale itself was the foundation, and in the medieval world, it was safer than water. Everyone drank it, peasants, nobles, children, because it was boiled and fermented, a shield against sickness. But boiled ale thickened with bread and spiked with spice was something else entirely. It was more than a drink, more than a meal, hovering awkwardly between both. To sip it was to taste heat, yeast, and sweetness colliding, the bread collapsing into lumps that floated like islands in a frothy sea. To chew it was to confront its texture directly. Chewy, soggy, and comforting in a way only hunger could make appealing. The spices were what transformed it from necessity into indulgence. Spices carried prestige, their origins traced to far-off markets in India or the Levant, and every pinch cost dearly. To season ale pudding with cinnamon or cloves was to flaunt wealth, to suggest that even your leftovers deserved the touch of the exotic. For peasants, the spice might be nothing more than pepper or a sprig of local herbs, but even that was enough to disguise the bitterness of ale gone flat. For nobles, however, it was an excuse to drown in luxury, ladling a bowl of what was essentially spiced sludge with a smile that said, "Yes, I can afford to waste saffron on bread soup." Taverns found a niche for ale puddings, serving them hot to customers who had drunk enough to ignore the questionable texture. The warmth soaked into bones after a long day in the fields, and the alcohol eased aches as much as it muddled complaints. Patrons dipped spoons or sometimes tore off more bread to scoop the thickened mixture, making the whole process messier but far more satisfying. It was the medieval equivalent of late-night drunk food. Sloppy, salty, strange, yet perfect for the moment. Households relied on it too, especially when nothing else was available. A pot of ale pudding could be stretched to feed a family, each bowl heavy enough to silence complaints for an hour or two. Children slurped it reluctantly, noses wrinkling at the yeasty tang, while adults justified it as fortifying. And in monasteries, where ale flowed steadily and bread was baked daily, the combination appeared regularly as a modest yet filling dish, praised as much for its thrift as its taste. But no matter where it appeared, spiced ale pudding carried a faint whiff of the ridiculous. Its consistency was uneven, sometimes watery, sometimes so thick it could be cut with a knife. Its flavor swung wildly depending on the ale's age and the spices available, ranging from pleasantly sweet to aggressively sour, and its appearance, brown, lumpy, steaming, invited unkind comparisons even in its own time. Yet people kept making it, because warmth and calories trumped aesthetics. At its best, it was surprisingly comforting. A good ale pudding, made with fresh bread and balanced spices, could feel rich, like custard gone rogue. At its worst, it was punishment food, sour and sticky, clinging to the tongue and stomach alike. Eating it was always a gamble, but hunger rarely left room for criticism. In a world of scarcity, even gross could be good enough. The dish also revealed the medieval obsession with transforming the ordinary. Bread and ale were the two pillars of daily life, but together they became something new, almost decadent, especially when dressed with spice. It was alchemy through boiling, base ingredients reimagined as luxury, or at least as variety. That act of transformation, more than the pudding itself, was what made it meaningful. So imagine it. A smoky tavern, mugs clinking, a cook ladling steaming bowls of thick, spiced ale pudding into waiting hands. Imagine a peasant cottage, where stale bread is broken into last week's brew and warmed until it becomes dinner. Imagine a noble hall, where the same dish appears but sprinkled with saffron, the scent masking its humble origins. It was warming, filling, slightly gross, and utterly medieval, a reminder that comfort food has never needed to be beautiful to matter. Spiced ale pudding was liquid bread with attitude, proof that hunger and imagination could turn even the strangest concoctions into tradition. Outside the shadow of stone churches, where incense hung in the air and bells tolled with numbing regularity, another kind of ritual played out at the stalls, the buying and biting of wafers. These weren't the fragile host of the Mass, though their shape and symbolism echoed it. They were thin biscuits, crisp and delicate, often pressed with images of saints, crosses, or simple patterns, and they carried both holiness and regret in equal measure. To nibble one was to flirt with the sacred while indulging in the profane, a reminder that even faith could be commercialized into snacks. The making of wafers was part craft, part ceremony. Batter was poured into iron molds engraved with saints, heraldry, or floral designs, then pressed tight over fire until the dough hissed and stiffened. The result was a crisp disc, golden at the edges, light enough to snap between fingers but sturdy enough to carry in a pouch. Bakers who specialized in wafers guarded their molds closely, for the patterns themselves were as much a selling point as the flavor. A wafer embossed with St. Peter wasn't just food. It was insurance, a portable prayer with crunch. Buyers held them up to the light, admired the imprint, and then ruined the art with the first bite. Churches were natural stages for wafer sales. Crowds gathered at feast days and holy days, spilling out from Mass with coins in hand. Vendors positioned themselves just beyond the sanctified threshold, calling out their wares, offering edible tokens that blurred the line between devotion and indulgence. Pilgrims on long roads snapped them up, both as sustenance and as souvenirs. Children tugged at their parents for a saint-faced biscuit, while adults pretended they were buying them for piety rather than appetite. It was a dance of appearances, everyone knowing the truth, yet all participating in the charade. The taste was simple, almost bland, a faint sweetness if honey was added, a hint of spice if the vendor had ambition, but usually little more than flour, water, and maybe a drop of oil. Their appeal was less in flavor and more in texture and symbolism. They crackled satisfyingly when broken, they looked impressive, and they offered the thrill of consuming something that carried echoes of the sacred. For peasants who rarely encountered luxury, that was enough. For nobles, wafers could be elevated with sugar, cinnamon, or even almond flour, transforming them into gilded delicacies served at banquets in silver trays. Yet at their core, they remained the same, crispy holy croutons masquerading as moral edibles. The irony of wafers was hard to miss. Everyone knew their proximity to the Eucharist lent them power, even if unofficial. Children whispered that eating a wafer with a saint's face could bring luck. Adults teased that too many wafers would spoil not just dinner, but also your soul, as though indulgence in these crunchy discs was itself a venial sin. The regret came later, not because they were unhealthy, though too many left you queasy, but because buying them meant admitting you'd traded coins for piety's cheap shadow. Still, the trade never stopped. Monasteries, too, recognized their value. Some produced wafers not for sale, but as part of their hospitality, offering them to pilgrims as gifts, a gesture of goodwill wrapped in crunch. Records speak of waferers, professional makers who supplied both secular and sacred markets, straddling the border between holy craft and commercial hustle. Their product, more than almost any other snack, embodied medieval contradictions, simple yet ornate, sacred yet secular, indulgent yet austere. Eating a wafer was always a small performance. You didn't simply chew, it was too thin to demand effort. Instead, you snapped, nibbled, let crumbs scatter. You admired the stamp of a saint's halo even as you cracked it apart. In noble halls, guests pretended to savor the artistry before devouring it in 2 bites. On the street, peasants ate quickly, hands greasy from other foods, not caring if the image smudged. Yet no matter how it was consumed, the wafer's identity remained split between food and symbol. What made wafers endure wasn't taste or nourishment, but ritual. They offered a moment of indulgence tied to rhythm, to ceremony, to shared belief. Buying one outside a church was as much a part of the day's cycle as bowing at the altar. Eating one on pilgrimage marked the road as sacred as much as the shrine itself. They weren't just snacks. They were edible punctuation marks in the story of medieval life, brief reminders that faith could be chewed as well as prayed. So imagine it. The press of the crowd after Mass, bells still echoing, vendors lifting baskets of thin golden discs. Imagine a child clutching one embossed with a saint, holding it too long before finally crunching it. Imagine nobles laughing over sugared versions at banquets, the delicate patterns admired, then forgotten in the snap of teeth. Wafers were crispy holy croutons, decorated with saints and regret, proof that in the medieval world, even the most sacred gestures could be reimagined as snacks. On saints' days, the medieval year briefly loosened its belt. Ordinary fare gave way to festival treats, and even those who lived most of the year on bread, peas, and porridge suddenly found themselves clutching something sweet, fried, or sugared. These holidays were not just religious markers but culinary explosions, chances to taste flavors otherwise hidden behind the heavy door of scarcity. For a few hours, markets smelled of hot oil, roasted nuts, and sticky syrups, and the whole town became a kitchen. Fried dough was the undisputed star of these occasions. Batter, sometimes thin, sometimes thick, was ladled into cauldrons of bubbling fat, sizzling into golden twists and rounds. The shapes varied: ribbons, knots, discs, or odd lumps that looked more like mistakes than planned indulgences. Vendors dusted them with honey, drizzled them with syrup, or tossed them in spice if they could afford it. The result was hot, greasy bliss, sweet enough to feel decadent and cheap enough that even peasants could taste it once a year. The oil burned fingers, the honey stuck to chins, but none of that mattered. It was fried dough, the sound of celebration captured in a bite. Candied nuts carried their own allure. Almonds, hazelnuts, or walnuts, roasted and coated in hard sugar, clinked against one another like coins when poured into paper packets. The nuts were expensive enough to signal luxury, and sugar still carried the prestige of rarity. To crunch through their sweet shells was to bite into wealth itself, however small the portion. Nobles might serve them in heaps at feasts, while peasants treasured a handful bought from a market stall, licking the sugar from their fingers long after the nuts were gone. But not every festival treat was simply indulgence. Many carried symbolic weight. Certain cakes were baked in shapes of crosses or doves, tied to the saint being honored. Colored wafers or breads were distributed to crowds, marking the day with edible tokens of piety. Some treats doubled as offerings, carried into churches before being eaten, reinforcing the sense that food itself was part of the ritual. To consume these symbolic snacks was to take part in the festival, not just with eyes and ears, but with tongue and stomach. The atmosphere of these feast days was intoxicating. Streets that normally reeked of dung and smoke now shimmered with the smells of cinnamon, roasted meat, and bubbling honey. Children darted between stalls, clutching sticky handfuls of sweets. Adults, freed briefly from toil, gathered to eat, drink, and laugh, the strict rhythms of the calendar yielding to joy. These festivals were not just about honoring saints. They were about relief from the monotony of survival, permission to indulge in foods that spoke of celebration rather than subsistence. Even the regret afterward was part of the ritual. Too much fried dough left stomachs aching, candied nuts stuck in teeth, and honey stains impossible to wash from tunics. Priests sometimes warned against overindulgence. sermons following swiftly after feast days, yet no one regretted enough to abstain the next time, because for most, these treats were not just food. They were memory, tradition, and joy made edible. So picture it, a medieval square on a saint's day, banners snapping in the wind, bells clanging, and the air alive with song. Vendors ladle hot batter into oil, the hiss rising like applause. Nuts roast over coals, their sugar bubbling into golden glass. Children tug at sleeves for one more sweet. Adults raise cups of spiced wine, and everyone eats until both body and spirit are full. Festival treats were once-a-year indulgences. Fried doughs, candied nuts, symbolic snacks that turned ordinary lives into celebrations, if only for a fleeting day. In the cloisters, where silence was broken only by prayer and the shuffle of sandals, hunger crept in quietly. Monks, bound by vows of austerity, were not supposed to indulge. Yet kitchens inside monasteries became some of the most inventive laboratories of the medieval world. What began as efforts to stretch ingredients into sustenance often blossomed into snacks so clever and comforting that they slipped beyond the cloister walls and into wider culture. These were the monastic munchies, foods born of piety but tinged with curiosity, balancing humility with a secret wink of pleasure. Cheese was perhaps the most famous monastic experiment, but it was far from the only one. Monks had time, patience, and an eye for process, which meant they tinkered endlessly with fermentation, preservation, and combinations of flavors. Breads baked in abbeys carried additions of herbs or nuts, turning simple loaves into fragrant meals in themselves. Ale brewed within stone walls was often seasoned with unusual botanicals gathered from monastery gardens, experiments in both medicine and indulgence. And in moments of quiet rebellion, monks turned leftover grains, fruits, and dairy into small, snackable creations designed to fill the hours between prayers without technically violating the strict rules of mealtimes. Sweetness was their most daring frontier. Sugar was rare and costly, but honey was plentiful, drawn from monastery hives tended with devotion. Monks drizzled it over fritters, baked it into spiced cakes, or mixed it with herbs to create candies that doubled as medicines. These medicinal treats were offered with solemn faces and the justification that they healed the body. But the twinkle in the monk's eye suggested he knew they healed the spirit just as well. Pilgrims who passed through were sometimes given these sticky tokens, proof that holiness could taste good. Not everything was sweet, of course. Lent challenged creativity the most. Meat was banned, dairy was restricted, yet hunger still gnawed. Monks responded by turning legumes, grains, and vegetables into patties, pies, and soups so hearty they bordered on indulgence. A monk might mash peas into a thick cake and fry it in oil, convincing himself it was penance while his stomach declared it a feast. They roasted root vegetables and doused them in vinegar or herbs until they tasted far grander than their humble origins. They experimented with fish, finding ways to preserve and season it so that even repetition felt fresh. Each dish was a loophole, a quiet negotiation with God through the medium of frying pans and clay pots. Wafers, too, found a second life in monasteries. Beyond their sacred role at the altar, monks produced versions intended purely for snacking, thin and crisp, sometimes layered with honey or flavored with nuts. These wafers were sold outside abbey gates, providing income while also spreading the reputation of the monastery as a place of both holiness and hospitality. Pilgrims carried them on long roads, associating their crunch with both the divine and the delicious. The atmosphere in the kitchens was as much about curiosity as sustenance. Recipes were written, copied, and exchanged between abbeys, building a quiet network of culinary innovation. While kings and nobles flaunted their excess with venison pies and sugared fruits, monks worked with constraints, and in doing so often stumbled on brilliance. What they created was not mere survival food but snacks with staying power. practical, flavorful, and memorable enough to seep into everyday life outside the cloisters. Yet there was always tension. The rule of Saint Benedict warned against gluttony, against food that tempted rather than sustained. Every monk who bit into a honey cake or fried legume patty knew the line between nourishment and indulgence was thin. But hunger is persuasive, and so is curiosity. And perhaps even monks understood that a life of prayer needed small pleasures to sustain the soul as much as the body. So imagine it, a stone abbey in the chill of early spring, bells ringing for vespers while the kitchen glows with the light of fire. A monk stirs a pot of ale thickened with grain, another flips cakes of mashed peas in oil, and a third wraps honey-drenched wafers in cloth for pilgrims waiting outside. The air smells of herbs, yeast, and sugar, a perfume of invention hidden behind walls of discipline. These were monastic munchies, small rebellions disguised as snacks, piety flavored with curiosity, proof that even under vows of restraint, the human hunger for comfort and creativity always found a way. The story of medieval junk food doesn't end with monasteries or market stalls. Some of those greasy, sticky, improvised snacks managed to stumble, stagger, and in some cases, glide smoothly into the modern era, reinvented, but still recognizable. If you've ever bitten into a donut, nibbled on candied nuts, crunched fried fish, or chewed on licorice candy, you've tasted a distant echo of medieval cravings. These foods endured because they tapped into something timeless, the human love of fried dough, sugar, salt, and loopholes. Take the apple fritter, that medieval cousin of the donut. In its earliest form, it was little more than stolen apples, coated in batter and fried in animal fat. Honey or spice might have been drizzled over if fortune allowed, but the essence was fruit disguised as indulgence. Centuries later, the fritter hasn't gone anywhere. It's just joined a family. The modern donut, puffy and glazed, and the fried apple ring at a county fair are both direct descendants. What was once desperation masquerading as dessert has become a staple of comfort food. Even the regret that follows, too heavy, too greasy, too much, remains unchanged, a shared human tradition across the centuries. Candied nuts tell the same story. In medieval markets, almonds and walnuts roasted in sugar were a treat reserved for feast days or for those with coins to spare. The crunch of caramelized sweetness was both novelty and luxury, a glimpse of wealth that could be carried in a pouch. Today, we buy them from street carts in winter, coated in cinnamon and sugar, wrapped in paper cones, the smell carrying across city squares. What was once a mark of nobility's indulgence has become ordinary street food. The same scent that drew peasants to festival stalls now lures holiday shoppers, proof that sugar plus nuts is a formula too perfect to disappear. Fried fish, too, swam the centuries. In the Middle Ages, frying was a way to make river catch edible and to stretch food through fasting rules. Fish, coated in flour and dunked in lard, became crisp, salty morsels that blurred the line between necessity and pleasure. By the 18th century, the English had cod and haddock sizzling in oil, married with potatoes to create fish and chips. The medieval snack of fried fish skin or battered eel paved the way, turning survival food into a national dish. Every time you crunch into a golden fillet from a paper wrapper, you're biting into a ritual older than the Reformation. Even candy has roots in medieval improvisation. Sucket, fruit boiled in honey or syrup until it gleamed like jewels, was the ancestor of modern candied fruit and eventually gummy sweets. Fennel seeds rolled in sugar, sold as medieval breath mints, laid the foundation for licorice drops, anise candies, and even the after-dinner mint. The logic hasn't changed. Take something sharp, herbal, or odd, coat it in sweetness, and turn it into a treat that doubles as a digestive excuse. The same gamble on teeth and the same promise of fresher breath have simply been dressed up in cellophane. Even pancakes endured. Thin, chewy, fried in lard, they were originally grease-fueled morale boosters. Today, they've become fluffy stacks drowned in syrup or crepes filled with cream and fruit. The medieval cook who fried scraps of batter in pig fat to feed hungry children would recognize the form instantly, though he might raise an eyebrow at the luxury of pouring sugar over the top instead of rationing it by the pinch. The shape remains. Only the abundance has changed. Ale-based puddings have vanished in name, but not in spirit. Medieval cooks boiled beer with spices and thickened it with bread into a gloopy mess meant to warm and stupefy. Today, you can order beer-battered onion rings, Guinness cake, or even bread pudding flavored with stout. The flavors are familiar, the presentation modernized. Liquid bread with attitude evolved into celebratory food rather than survival sludge, but the impulse is the same. Take alcohol, take bread, combine them, and call it comfort. What's striking is not just that these snacks survived, but that they thrived. Medieval junk food appealed because it was cheap, quick, and indulgent, often bending rules of fasting or poverty to carve out pleasure. Those same qualities define modern street food and comfort food. Frying transforms scraps into gold. Sugar turns medicine into candy. Alcohol becomes edible in clever disguises. Hunger invents and habit perfects. So when you walk through a fairground with a powdered donut in one hand, candied almonds in the other, and the smell of fried fish in the air, you're not just indulging in modern treats. You're participating in a lineage of cravings that stretches back centuries, to peasants sneaking fritters on feast days and nobles dunking bread into spiced wine with as much dignity as they could muster. The junk foods that survived into our diets did so because they tapped into something deeper than time, the human refusal to let survival be joyless. They endured because grease, sugar, salt, and heat always win.